The reading of the will was supposed to be just a formality. I was only the caretaker who had looked after Eleanor Whitmore in her final months. Her mansion was filled with relatives who hadn't visited her in years, all of them waiting for their share of her fortune. The lawyer's voice echoed through the silent room. I, Eleanor Grace Whitmore, leave my entire estate, all properties and assets, to my granddaughter, Margaret Johnson. I froze. My name is Claire Johnson. But Margaret, that wasn't me, or at least I thought it wasn't. Then the lawyer looked directly at me, his eyes steady. Miss Johnson, would you please state your full legal name? In that moment, my world shifted forever. Why was my name being called? How could I, a single mother and a nurse, possibly be the heir to Eleanor Whitmore's empire? What secret had been hidden in my family all these years? And why had Eleanor chosen me over her entire bloodline? Before we dive into this unbelievable story of betrayal, family secrets, and an inheritance that changed everything, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if life ever pulled you into family drama you never expected, make sure to hit that subscribe button. That way, even if you can't watch until the end today, you won't miss this story, or the many others we share here every week. Because sometimes when family breaks, the truth that surfaces will shock you more than anything else. My name is Claire Johnson. I never imagined my life would intersect with someone like Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in the state. To me, she was just a name I'd heard in passing, the kind of woman whose face appeared in glossy magazines, whose properties dominated the skyline. I was a single mother, juggling hospital shifts and side jobs, barely keeping up with bills, and saving every dollar for my son Daniel's college education. Our worlds couldn't have been further apart. It all began with a phone call from my supervisor at the nursing agency. Claire, I know you're already overloaded, but we've had a special request. It's Mrs. Whitmore. The name alone made me pause. She's burned through 5 caregivers in the past 6 months. No one lasts, but the family is desperate. They're offering double the usual rate. Double pay. The words were tempting, but I already worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, and Daniel was in his final year of high school. Every hour I spent away from him weighed heavily on me. I don't know, I said slowly. What makes her so difficult? She refuses her medication, criticizes everything, throws tantrums. One nurse quit after a vase was thrown at her head. My supervisor sighed. But Claire, you're different. You have patience, empathy. You've handled cases that broke others. If anyone can manage Mrs. Whitmore, it's you. I wanted to say no. I wanted to protect the little time I had left with my son before he left for college. But then I thought about the tuition bills waiting on my kitchen, about the car that needed repairs, about the nights Daniel pretended not to worry when he saw me calculating expenses at the table. Finally, I exhaled. All right, I'll do it, but I want to meet her first before committing. 2 days later, I drove up to the Whitmore estate. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a fortress. Tall iron gates, sprawling gardens, fountains that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The mansion rose from the ground like a palace, its stone walls whispering of old money and old secrets. I was greeted by Mrs. Kent, the housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s. She carried herself with the air of someone who had seen generations of Whitmores come and go. Follow me, she said, briskly. Her shoes clicked against marble floors as we passed through hallways lined with oil, paintings and chandeliers. Everything about the house felt heavy, as if it bore the weight of a family that valued appearances above warmth. She's in the sunroom, Mrs. Kent warned. She's having a bad day. My stomach tightened. When I stepped into the room, I saw her. Eleanor Whitmore, 82, frail in body but with eyes that still burned like embers. She sat in a velvet armchair, draped in a cashmere shawl, her posture regal despite her illness. The moment she saw me, her lips curled into a smirk. Another one? How long will you last? The record is 3 weeks. I could have bowed my head, tried to appease her like others had, but exhaustion had stripped me of pretense. That depends, I said calmly, pulling up a chair to sit at her level. How long do you think you'll need a caretaker? Her eyebrows shot up. For the first time in what must have been years, Eleanor Whitmore looked genuinely surprised. There was a long pause before she chuckled dryly. Bold. Most of them tremble like leaves when they walk in here. Her voice, though brittle, carried authority, the kind forged in boardrooms and high society galas. I'm not here to tremble, I replied. I'm here to take care of you, whatever that looks like. Her gaze lingered on me, sharp and unyielding, as though she were peeling back layers to see who I really was. At last, she leaned back. We'll see. We'll see. That was my first glimpse into the fortress that was Eleanor Whitmore, and though I didn't know it then, that day marked the beginning of something I could never have imagined. Over the next few weeks, I discovered that her reputation for cruelty was not entirely deserved. Yes, she was demanding, often critical, sometimes downright harsh. But beneath it all, I caught glimpses of a loneliness so profound it silenced my own complaints. She had wealth beyond measure, yet the people closest to her circled like vultures, waiting for her to take her final breath. One afternoon, as I adjusted her blanket, she said suddenly, "Do you know what frightens me?" I expected her to mention pain or death. Instead, she whispered, "I'm afraid of being forgotten, of leaving nothing behind but buildings with my name etched in stone. What good is a legacy if no one remembers the woman? Only the wealth." Her words stayed with me long after I drove home that night. For the first time, I wondered if there was more to Eleanor Whitmore than the icy facade she showed the world. At first, working for Eleanor Whitmore felt like walking a tightrope. Every day I arrived at the mansion, with my bag of supplies and a silent prayer that I would make it through without provoking her wrath. Her sharp tongue could cut, deeper than a scalpel, if the tea was too hot. She'd snap. If the blanket was folded wrong, she'd scoff. If I reminded her to take her medication, she'd glare at me with eyes that seemed to say, "You dare tell me what to do?" But I reminded myself why I was there. Not for her approval, not for comfort. I was there for Daniel. For his future. For the tuition bills that arrived like clockwork each month. Still, something about Eleanor intrigued me. For all her complaints, she never once asked me to leave, and that was unusual. The stories I'd heard from the agency painted her as impossible, yet somehow, I was still standing after weeks had passed. One evening, as the sunset spilled gold across the windows, I found her staring out at the gardens. Her posture was rigid, her jaw clenched, but her eyes, they carried a sorrow so heavy it seemed to press down on her frail shoulders. Without turning to me, she said, "You're persistent. Most of them left by now." "I suppose I don't give up easily," I replied. She finally turned, her face illuminated by the dying light. "You'll learn. Persistence isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it just means you don't know when to walk away." There was bitterness in her tone, but also something else. Weariness, the kind that comes from a lifetime of disappointments. I began to notice the fortress she had built around herself, the way she kept her relatives at arm's length, only allowing them in when there was a holiday or some formal event. The way her staff spoke of her with respect, but not warmth, as if they served a queen rather than cared for a woman. And the way she deflected any attempt at kindness with sarcasm. as if genuine compassion was a language she no longer trusted. One afternoon, as I prepared her tea, she watched me closely. "Tell me something, Claire. Why are you really here? Surely a young woman like you has better things to do than babysit an old woman waiting to die." Her bluntness made me flinch, but I told her the truth. "I'm here because I need the money. My son's about to go to college. It's expensive. I'll work as many hours as I have to so he has a chance at a better life." Her eyes narrowed, studying me as if weighing my soul. "And what about you? Don't you want something for yourself?" The question caught me off guard. I had buried my own dreams so deep I hardly thought of them anymore. But maybe it was the intensity of her gaze, or the fact that no one had asked me in years. So I said quietly, "I used to dream of opening a community center, a place where single mothers like me could get support, where kids could study safely, where families could find hope. But dreams don't pay bills." For the first time, Eleanor's sharp features softened. She leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. "Hope," she murmured. "Do you know how many people I've met who wanted nothing from me but money? Not one of them spoke of hope." Her words lingered in the air like incense. I realized then that beneath her icy armor, there was a woman who longed for something more than wealth, more than power. She longed for connection, but she didn't know how to ask for it. That night, as I gathered my things to leave, she surprised me again. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said softly, almost to herself. "Someone stubborn, too. Someone who believed kindness was stronger than ambition." I wanted to ask who she meant, but the moment passed. The fortress slammed shut again. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes back to steel. "Good night, Claire," she said curtly, as I drove home. I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor Whitmore was testing me. Every question, every glare, every sudden flash of vulnerability. It was as if she were searching for cracks in my armor while hiding her own. And though I told myself I didn't care, that this was just a job, a small voice inside me whispered otherwise. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a reason I was still there when so many others had walked away. Weeks slipped by in the Whitmore mansion. The routine became familiar. Morning medication, afternoon walks in the garden, evenings filled with quiet conversations. But nothing about Eleanor Whitmore was truly routine. Every day I discovered another layer, another fragment of the woman behind the reputation. She was still sharp, still critical at times, but she had also begun to talk, not about trivial things, not about her vast fortune or her properties, but about her past. And that's when the seeds of something unexpected began to take root. One evening, rain tapped gently against the windows as I poured her tea. Eleanor's gaze was distant, her eyes fixed on memories only she could see. "Did you ever lose someone, Claire?" she asked suddenly. The question startled me. I thought of my mother, who passed away when I was in my 20s, leaving me to navigate motherhood alone. "Yes," I said softly. "I lost my mom. She was my anchor." Eleanor nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "I lost my daughter," she whispered. Her voice trembled for the first time since I'd known her. She was headstrong, stubborn. She had my spirit but none of my caution. We fought terribly, and then one day she left. She never came back. The pain in her tone cut through me. I had seen Eleanor furious. Sarcastic, dismissive, but this was different. This was grief, raw and unhealed. "I had a granddaughter," she continued, almost in a daze. Her name was Margaret, a sweet little girl with dark hair and the most curious eyes. After my daughter left, I lost them both. I tried to find them, but it was as if they vanished. Do you know what it's like, Claire, to wonder if someone you love is still alive, or if they think you stopped loving them? Her words struck a chord I wasn't prepared for. I thought of Daniel. What if he ever believed, even for a moment, that I didn't love him? The thought alone shattered me. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I can't imagine how that must feel." She looked at me then, her eyes narrowing as if searching for something in my face. "What's your full name, Claire?" The question seemed odd, but I answered without hesitation. "Claire Margaret Johnson." The cup in her hand trembled slightly. She set it down carefully, as though steadying herself. "Margaret," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's quite a coincidence." I gave a small, awkward laugh. It was my mother's choice. She said Margaret was a family name, though she never told me much more than that. Eleanor's expression shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The sharpness in her eyes softened into something closer to recognition, or perhaps hope. She didn't press the matter, but I could feel the weight of her stare long after I left the room. From that evening on, Eleanor seemed unusually curious about my life. She asked about my childhood, about my mother, about the towns we lived in. At first, I assumed she was simply passing time, but the more questions she asked, the more I realized her interest was pointed, deliberate. "What was your mother's maiden name?" she asked one afternoon. "Where did she grow up? Did you ever meet her parents?" The questions felt strange, but I answered as best I could. My mother had always been private, avoiding talk of extended family. She told me our little family of 2 was enough. I had never questioned it until now. One night, as I left the mansion, I caught Eleanor in her study on the phone. Her back was to me. Her voice hushed but urgent. "No, keep searching," she said. "There must be records. I need proof." I should have walked away, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. Proof of what? And why did it sound like she was talking about me? I didn't dare ask, but the unease lingered. Why was she so interested in my family? Why did my middle name shake her so deeply? The storm was gathering beneath the surface, though I couldn't yet see its shape. All I knew was that Eleanor Whitmore, the woman I thought I was simply caring for, seemed to be piecing together a puzzle that somehow involved me. And for the first time, I began to wonder if our lives had crossed paths by chance, or by fate. It didn't take long before I met the rest of the Whitmore family. They came sweeping into the mansion like a storm, uninvited, yet entitled, their voices filling the quiet halls that had once carried only Eleanor's sharp remarks and my cautious footsteps. Suddenly, the house was alive with chatter, but it wasn't the warmth of reunion. It was the greedy hum of people circling a prize. Her younger brother, Richard, arrived first, a man in his 70s, still clinging to the remnants of charm that had long since withered into arrogance. He greeted Eleanor with exaggerated affection, kissing her cheek before immediately asking about her will. He barely acknowledged me except to mutter, "Another nurse. How long until this one quits?" Then came Eleanor's nieces and nephews, dressed in designer clothes, whispering behind manicured hands. They complimented the chandeliers, admired the paintings, and asked pointed questions about the mansion's value. Not one of them asked Eleanor how she was feeling. I hovered in the background, watching as their words pricked her like tiny needles. Her lips pursed tighter with every shallow laugh, every greedy glance. By the time they left, she was trembling with fury. "They're not family," she spat as Mrs. Kent helped her to bed. "They're scavengers, waiting for me to die so they can pick apart my bones." I didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong. Days later, another visitor arrived. This time a woman who introduced herself as Vivian. She was striking, with perfectly styled hair, a designer purse slung over her arm, and a confidence that filled the room. "I'm Margaret," she announced smoothly. "Your long-lost granddaughter." The air in the room froze. Even I went still. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Vivian smiled, a touch too rehearsed. I've been searching for you, she said sweetly. I only want to be part of the family again. My stomach tightened. Something about her felt wrong. Her words were honey, but her eyes glittered with calculation. Eleanor didn't react right away. She simply tilted her head, her expression unreadable. At last she said, "Is that so? And what do you know about family, my dear?" Vivian hesitated, just long enough for the silence to stretch uncomfortably. Then she launched into a tale about being abandoned, struggling alone, finally finding her way back. It was a good story. Too good. Too polished. When she finally left, Eleanor sat silently for a long while. Then she turned to me. "Do you believe her?" I chose my words carefully. I believe people can say anything when money's involved. But family isn't proven by words. It's proven by actions. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharp as glass. Remember that, Claire. Words can deceive, but actions never lie. In the weeks that followed, the family returned again and again. Some came with flowers, others with forced smiles, all carrying the same unspoken demand. What will you leave us? The house, once a fortress of silence, became a battleground of whispered arguments and veiled threats. Through it all, Eleanor leaned more heavily on me, not just for medication or meals, but for presence. She would grip my hand during their visits, her eyes hard as steel, her lips set in defiance. It was as if I had become her anchor, the only person in the room who wasn't calculating what her death would be worth. But the tension wore on her. Each visit left her weaker, her breath shorter, her temper thinner, and sometimes, when the mansion grew quiet again, I'd find her in the study, murmuring on the phone, making arrangements she wouldn't explain. "I have to be sure," she whispered one evening, almost to herself, "sure that when I'm gone, what I leave behind won't be wasted." Her eyes drifted to me then, searching, almost pleading. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I think she was already making her decision. The vultures circled closer every day, but what none of them knew, what even I didn't realize, was that Eleanor Whitmore had already chosen where her legacy would go, and it wasn't to them. By late spring, Eleanor's health began to decline sharply. The sharp woman who once barked orders at me now spent most days in her bed, her voice softer, her hands frailer. But her mind was still sharp, still restless, still full of secrets she refused to reveal. Some days she drifted in and out of sleep, lost in the haze of pain medication. Other days she demanded to sit in the garden, no matter how weak she felt. She said she wanted to breathe fresh air while she still could, so I wheeled her chair out beneath the blooming magnolias, where the air smelled of earth and springtime. It was on one of those afternoons that she surprised me again. "Claire," she said suddenly, her voice steadier than usual. "Tell me, do you believe people can change?" I thought about it. "I believe people can choose to," I answered carefully. "But not everyone does. Some cling to their anger, their mistakes, because it's easier than letting go." She was quiet for a long time, watching the petals drift from the trees. Then she spoke. "I've made mistakes. Mistakes that cost me my family. My pride, my stubbornness. They built walls I could never tear down." Her voice trembled. "And now I don't have much time left to make it right." I reached out and laid a hand over hers. She squeezed it, her skin papery and cool. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever," she whispered. "You've shown me that kindness still exists, even when the world feels cold." Her eyes lifted to mine, sharp and piercing despite her weakness. "Promise me something, Claire. Promise me that no matter what happens after I'm gone, you will never let money or bitterness change who you are." The weight of her request pressed into me. I thought of Daniel, of the struggles we had faced, of the temptation that wealth could bring. And yet, in that moment, I understood exactly what she meant, I promise. I said softly, "I'll stay true to who I am." A small smile touched her lips. Good, because character is the only inheritance that matters. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the garden bathed in golden light, the air filled with birdsong. And though I didn't realize it then, those words would echo in my heart for the rest of my life. 3 nights later, Eleanor's breathing grew shallow. I stayed by her side, holding her hand as the hours slipped past midnight. Her family had all gone home, too tired or too busy to keep vigil. But I couldn't leave her alone. She stirred once, her eyes fluttering open. Her gaze found mine, and for a moment, the sharpness returned. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a sick old woman." Tears filled my eyes. "You were never just that," I said, her lips curved faintly. "You'll understand soon. Everything is in place." Then, with one last squeeze of my hand, she closed her eyes, and Eleanor Grace Whitmore, the formidable woman who had built an empire, took her final breath in the quiet of her sunlit room. I sat there long after, the weight of her hand still lingering in mine, her final words echoing in my ears. Everything is in place. At the funeral days later, her family gathered again, dressed in black, their eyes already darting toward the lawyer's briefcase. To them, her death was not an ending, but the beginning of a fight over what she had left behind. I stood at the back of the service, feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't mine. Yet even from that distance, I could almost hear her voice reminding me of the promise I had made. Never let money or bitterness change who you are. I had no idea then just how important that promise would become, or how completely my life was about to change. The day of Eleanor's funeral was gray and heavy, as if the sky itself carried the weight of her passing. Clouds hung low, pressing against the earth, while a thin drizzle slicked the driveway that wound up to the Whitmore mansion. Inside the grand chapel, the pews filled quickly, not with friends, not with people who had loved her, but with faces I recognized from her living room. Her brother Richard, his posture stiff with self-importance. Her nieces and nephews, dressed in black designer suits, whispering behind their veils of false grief. Even Vivian, the woman who had once claimed to be her long-lost granddaughter, was there, dabbing her eyes dramatically, as if she had lost her dearest confidant. I sat quietly in the back row, away from the cluster of relatives, feeling like an outsider. I wasn't family. I was just the caretaker who had held her hand in her final days. And yet, somehow, I knew her in a way they never had. The service was brief, efficient, almost businesslike. The minister spoke of Eleanor's accomplishments, her empire, her contributions to the city. But no one spoke of her laughter, or her regrets, or the quiet afternoons we had shared in the garden. It struck me then just how invisible the truest parts of a person can become when the world only remembers their wealth. After the final prayer, I lingered in my seat, watching as the family huddled together in small groups. But their hushed tones carried easily in the chapel's still air. "Do you think she left me the summer estate?" one niece asked, her voice eager. "No," another hissed. "She always liked me best." "You'll see." Richard puffed out his chest and muttered, "It doesn't matter. The bulk will come to me. It's only right. I'm her brother." Their greed was so naked it made my stomach turn. Eleanor had been right. They were vultures. They had circled her in life, and now in death, they circled what she had left behind. As the family began to disperse, a tall man in a dark suit approached me. His presence was calm, commanding, his silver hair neat, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Miss Johnson?" he asked. I stood, startled. "Yes? My name is Charles Bennett. I'm Mrs. Whitmore's attorney." She left very specific instructions that you attend the reading of her will. I blinked in confusion. Me? I was just her nurse. I don't think I belong there. He shook his head firmly. On the contrary, Mrs. Whitmore was quite insistent. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock at my office downtown. Don't be late. Before I could respond, he had already turned, making his way toward the cluster of family members who swarmed him like bees to honey. I could hear the rising pitch of their voices as they demanded answers. What about the estate? What about the stocks? Did she mention me? But Mr. Bennet only raised a hand for silence. All of your questions will be answered tomorrow. Until then, please be patient. The tension in the room was palpable. Faces tightened. Lips pursed, eyes narrowed. The air felt charged. Like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I slipped out quietly, my heart pounding. Why had Eleanor insisted I be there? I wasn't family. I had no claim to her fortune. No reason to sit among them as they clawed at each other for scraps. But then I remembered her final words. Everything is in place. As I drove home in the drizzle, the weight of those words pressed on me like a stone. Eleanor Whitmore, even in death, was still pulling strings, still orchestrating something larger than I could yet see. And tomorrow, when the will was read, the storm inside that family would finally break. The next afternoon, I walked into Mr. Bennet's downtown office with trembling hands. The waiting room was already packed with Whitmores. Richard sat at the head of a long leather sofa, puffed up like a king about to claim his crown. His children clustered nearby, whispering fiercely. Vivian was there too, her lips painted in perfect crimson, her eyes cool and calculating. When Mr. Bennet opened the door to the conference room, the family surged forward like a tidal wave. I followed quietly, wishing I could disappear. The room was elegant, lined with shelves of leather-bound books. At the center stood a polished oak table, gleaming under the weight of anticipation. Please be seated, Mr. Bennet said firmly. He waited until the room quieted before unfolding a thick document. This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Whitmore. The air grew still. He began with smaller bequests, donations to charities, gifts to longtime staff. The housekeeper received a generous pension, the driver a trust fund for his grandchildren. The family shifted restlessly, barely disguising their impatience. Richard finally huffed. Yes, but get to the point. What of the estate? Mr. Bennet adjusted his glasses. And now for the bulk of Mrs. Whitmore's estate, including all properties, investments, and assets, valued at approximately $20 million. The room fell silent, breaths caught, eyes wide. I leave everything, he said slowly, to my beloved granddaughter, Margaret Johnson. The words detonated like a bomb. What? Richard roared, leaping to his feet. That's absurd. She doesn't have a granddaughter. Gasps erupted around the table. Accusations flew like arrows. She must have been tricked. That nurse, she's the one. All eyes turned toward me. I froze, heat rushing to my cheeks. My name is Claire Johnson, I stammered. But Margaret, that isn't. Mr. Bennet raised a hand for silence. Miss Johnson. What is your full legal name? The room held its breath. My voice shook as I answered, Claire Margaret Johnson. The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed against my ears until Richard exploded again. Coincidence. Nothing more. This woman manipulated her way in, and I will contest this. Mr. Bennet's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Before you waste your breath, Mr. Whitmore, you should know that Mrs. Whitmore anticipated these objections. She left behind thorough documentation. He pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. DNA results, obtained from a personal item Miss Johnson used during her employment. The test confirms a direct biological connection. Murmurs spread like wildfire. My stomach lurched. DNA? She had tested me without my knowledge. But before I could speak, Mr. Bennett continued. In addition, Mrs. Whitmore recorded several conversations, video and audio, between herself and two individuals who both claimed to be Margaret. He pressed a button, and a screen flickered to life. There, on the wall appeared Vivian, her smile sweet, her tone syrupy, but the video caught her when she thought no one was watching, rolling her eyes, muttering about Eleanor's fortune, whispering into her phone. The old woman will cave eventually. Gasps filled the room, Vivian's face drained of color. That's out of context, she snapped, but no one listened. The next video appeared, me, sitting in the garden with Eleanor. I was laughing awkwardly as I poured tea, telling her about my dream of opening a community center. She was listening, nodding slowly, her face soft in a way most of the family had never seen. This, Mr. Bennett said firmly, is the contrast Mrs. Whitmore wanted recorded. Words of greed versus words of compassion. She wanted it clear that her decision was not made under manipulation, but through careful observation. The room erupted again, but this time the anger felt hollow, desperate. They hurled insults, threats of lawsuits, accusations of fraud, but Mr. Bennett stood calm, movable. Everything is documented, he said, every step, every test, every conversation. Contesting this will is not only futile, it will expose each of you to scrutiny you may not welcome. Finally, he turned back to me. Miss Johnson, your grandmother left you a letter. Would you like me to read it now, or privately? My throat tightened. Now, I whispered. He unfolded a sealed envelope, his voice softening as he read. My dearest Margaret, though I know you go by Claire, I never had the courage to repair what was broken between your mother and me. My pride stole years I can never recover, but in you, I see the love and strength that once bound our family. You cared for me when you had no reason to. You saw me as a woman, not as a fortune. That is why I leave everything to you. Not because of blood alone, but because you reminded me that family is not measured by inheritance, but by kindness. Use this gift well, and know that in my final days, I was not alone because of you. By the time he finished, tears blurred my vision. The room was silent, stunned, as if the very walls had absorbed her words. For once, no one spoke, not even Richard. And in that silence, I realized the storm had broken, the truth had been laid bare, and my life would never be the same. The letter shook in my hands as Mr. Bennett finished reading it aloud. Around the table, the Whitmore family sat in stunned silence. The same relatives who moments earlier had been spitting accusations and threats now avoided my eyes, their outrage reduced to whispers that carried no weight. For the first time, I felt their powerlessness. Eleanor had spoken from beyond the grave, and her word was final. I wiped at my tears, but they kept coming. Not because of the fortune suddenly placed in my lap, but because of the woman who had written those words. The Eleanor I had known in her final months. The proud, sharp, lonely woman had finally let her guard down, and she had chosen me, not just as an heir, but as family. Mr. Bennett folded the letter gently, sliding it back into the envelope. There is more, he said softly. She left you something else. In her study behind the collection of Dickens novels, there's a box. She wanted you to have it. My chest tightened. What's in it? He smiled faintly. I think it's best you discover that yourself. The rest of the meeting dissolved into grumbling protests and hollow threats from Richard and the others, but their words barely registered. I gathered my things and left quickly, the envelope clutched tightly in my hand, as if it were more valuable than the fortune that came with it. That evening, I returned to the mansion. The house was quiet now, emptied of voices and greed. It almost felt peaceful, as though Eleanor's spirit had finally chased away the vultures. I made my way to the study, the room where she had spent so many evenings by the fire. The shelves still smelled faintly of her perfume. My hands trembled as I searched behind the row of Dickens novels, just as Mr. Bennet had instructed. And there it was, a small wooden box polished smooth, its brass latch worn with age. I carried it to the desk and opened it slowly. Inside was an album, its leather cover cracked but carefully preserved. When I turned the first page, my breath caught. Photographs, dozens of them. My mother as a child grinning at the camera, her hair in braids. My grandmother Eleanor, younger, radiant, her arm around my mother. There were birthdays, holidays, candid shots of laughter and life, a family I had never known, captured in frozen moments of joy. Tears blurred my vision as I turned the pages. I had grown up believing my mother's family was gone, that we were alone in the world. But here, in my hands, was proof of a connection I'd never been allowed to see. On the final page, I found a photo that undid me completely. It was Eleanor holding a baby. Me. Her eyes were bright, her smile unguarded, her arms wrapped protectively around the child in her lap. On the back, written in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "For Ellie, so you'll never forget." I pressed the picture to my chest and wept. All the bitterness, all the years of silence between my mother and Eleanor. It had stolen so much. But in that moment, I understood what Eleanor had been trying to do. She couldn't undo the past, but she could give me back a piece of it. Later that night, I sat in what had once been Eleanor's chair, the letter beside me, the photo album on my lap. Her words echoed in my mind. Character is the only inheritance that matters. She had given me wealth, yes, but more than that, she had given me a legacy. A chance to use what she left not for myself alone, but for something greater. And I knew with a clarity that steadied me exactly what I would do. The mansion would not become a trophy or a monument to wealth. It would become a place of healing, the kind of place I had once dreamed of. A center for mothers and children, for families who needed help, for those who had no one else to turn to. Eleanor had built an empire. Now, through me, her empire would become a refuge, and in that choice, her final gift would live on. As I closed the album and blew out the lamp, I felt something I hadn't in years. I felt that I was not alone, that I had a family, not just by blood but by choice, by the love and trust Eleanor had finally entrusted to me. And though she was gone, her voice lingered in my heart, steady and sure. Everything is in place. 6 months later, the Whitmore mansion no longer felt like a fortress. The iron gates still stood tall, the marble floors still gleamed, but the air inside had changed. Children's laughter now echoed through the halls. Mothers gathered in bright rooms, sharing meals, stories, and hope. Doctors and counselors moved through the once silent corridors, offering care to families who had nowhere else to go. The Eleanor Whitmore Community Center had opened its doors, and every day, as I walked those halls, I felt her presence. Not the cold, distant Eleanor the world had known, but the woman I had glimpsed in her final days, the one who feared being forgotten, who longed for connection, who wanted her wealth to mean something more than numbers on a page. Her art collection had been donated to local museums, the proceeds funding scholarships for young women in nursing and social work. Her investment properties had been converted into affordable housing for families in need. And her mansion, the heart of her empire, had become a sanctuary where people could rebuild their lives. I kept enough of her fortune to secure my son's future, to give us a measure of stability we had never known. But the rest I gave away not out of obligation, but out of purpose. Because I understood now what Eleanor had tried to teach me. Wealth without kindness is hollow, but when guided by love, can heal wounds far deeper than money alone. Some nights, after the families had gone home, I sat in Eleanor's old study, now my office. The photo album rested on my desk, always open to the picture of her holding me as a baby. I traced the outline of her smile and whispered, I kept my promise. She had told me not to let money or bitterness change me, and I hadn't. If anything, I felt more myself than ever before, not just a nurse, not just a single mother, but a woman carrying forward the best of what Eleanor had left behind. Because in the end, her greatest gift wasn't the fortune, it wasn't the mansion or the assets or the wealth. Her greatest gift was the reminder that family is more than blood, more than inheritance. It is the people who see you, truly see you, and choose to love you anyway. And as I watched mothers and children find safety under Eleanor's roof, I knew she had finally found her place in this world, not in the cold lines of her will, but in the living legacy of kindness. So when people ask me what I inherited, I don't say $20 million. I say I inherited a promise, a purpose, and the proof that even the most broken families can leave behind something beautiful.